even more underdeveloped, but in even more of demand. Iraq has the 12th largest proven natural gas reserves, and they're about to set on an exploration round that will most likely improve that standing in the global natural gas sector. And the end goal, which has been kind of moved around and pushed, the deadline's been pushed back, but Iraq says it wants to be a net exporter of oil, of natural gas, of fuels, and electricity, which presents many opportunities and probably many more challenges. But the goal is to kind of fast-track Iraq back onto this road that they were on, this trajectory that they were on prior to when Saddam Hussein came to power, and the decades after that, what happened in the country. But Iraq right now, according to the official figures, exported 2.15 million barrels per day in March, which brought in over $7 billion in state revenue. Oil accounts for between 90 and 96% of all of state revenue. Proven reserves, they just upgraded it to 143.1 billion barrels, which, depending on who you're talking to and whether you bring in oil sands, et cetera, but what I commonly say is that Saudi Arabia, then Iran, and then Iraq for proven oil reserves. They're in the process of a long process of kind of bringing in the Kurdistan region, which has been explored over the past 8 years semi-unilaterally, which will increase between probably 30 to 40 billion barrels, and then the fourth bidding round, which will, there's estimates that Iraq's oil reserves could double when the country's fully explored. That's a broad snapshot on the opportunities, and I'll try to go quick as possible through the challenges to leave time for questions and to avoid ending on a sour note. So when Iraq moves forward, they're going to have to take into consideration. Their goal is 13.5 million barrels per day of production capacity, which the government insists should be noted that it's not production. They don't plan necessarily to produce 13.5 million barrels per day. So that brings into issues with the contracts with the international oil companies. If they have capacity but aren't producing, contractually they actually have to pay the oil companies to not produce from the fields. That gets into issues of the market. 7 years, 10 years, 15 years down the road, will the market want 13.5 million barrels per day from Iraqi oil? And then if it does, well, Saudi Arabia and Iran have already said that they're going to increase their production capacity right along the same timeline that Iraq said that it will. So that brings into the issues of kind of how OPEC will force Iraq into certain strategies when it comes to developing the oil sector. And then it goes into clearly relationships with other countries, but especially Iraq's neighbors come into play. Each have a set of unique circumstances and evolving negotiations. Clearly, obviously, Saudi Arabia and Iran, both the major powerhouses of OPEC, and in regional instability and potential stability, will have their say about what they want Iraq to do, and then if the worst fears are realized, that the two will use Iraq as kind of a battlefield against each other down the road. But Iraq is attempting to play these pipeline politics and energy diplomacy, where they are looking at bridging the gaps with countries that haven't necessarily been supportive of a prosperous future in Iraq over the past few years. For example, building a pipeline from Iran into Syria, or trying to build a second pipeline with Turkey, or talking about rebuilding pipelines with Jordan to Saudi Arabia, and there has been talk even gas line into Kuwait, all of which will only come if there can be a kind of a net positive for everybody in terms of some stability and removing some of the challenges to Iraq that these countries tend to pose, and sometimes vice versa. But looking domestically, there are some realities. The 13.5 plus million barrels per day of production capacity is technically feasible, but aside from the issues that we've talked about, that I've just mentioned, the market, can Iraq actually take the steps necessary for that to happen? Very technical steps, putting together a master plan and following through on that, building the infrastructure necessary from the storage tanks and the export terminals to rehabbing the current fields, to simply building proper pipelines and pumping stations that take crude from the field to a refinery. I mean, all of this is interconnected, and all of this would have to happen for Iraq to move forward on that goal. And even government officials have said that they're looking at half of the 13.5 million barrels per day actual production within the 7 years. It brings into issues. The infrastructure is a massive problem and a series of bottlenecks, some of which are being alleviated right now. There's the Southern Export expansion project, which will it's supposed to add 1.8 million barrels per day of export capacity by the end of this year, but most likely early next year. But the question is, can you get the oil from these southern oil fields to the storage the storage tanks, which haven't been built yet, and so the pipelines to the storage tanks haven't been finished yet. That's kind of it calls into question what the true capacity will be of exports. And then you have the issues of what the Iraqis, with the international oil companies face. Although Iraq has kind of moved forward in its own very unique way of keeping a nationalist oil sector while bringing in foreign oil companies on terms that despite what the oil companies say, they like it as well. And but they're having these issues, which are, some of it is just kind of a bureaucratic, historical bureaucracy that hasn't been worked out yet. Who's going to sign the contract? Who's going to put their name on a contract to import valves if there's another person who may be the one that's responsible for this, and thus if you sign it, then you could be charged with corruption or taking bribes or subverting authority, things like this. And then there are the things that are clearly manufactured by the current situation, the current politics. For example, if you're an oil company contracted for a multi-billion-dollar contract to develop the Rumaila oil field into the second largest oil field in the world, why do you have to wait 5-6 months to get a visa for your top executive to get into the country, and let alone the other people that have to be shuffled in and out of the country to do the work in the oil field? And this is, as we've reported, this is part of the problem where because the government hasn't been fully formed and the prime minister is de facto interior minister, everything basically had to be signed by his office. So we're talking about visas for business people who have government contracts, have to get visas approved by the prime minister's office. Now, there's ways around this, and some of the companies have found this for some of the top executives. But this shows some of the constraints that international oil companies face when investing in Iraq, and thus the constraints that Iraq will face in reaching their goal. I was talking to a contractor